Everyone, and thank you for watching this heavily adapted contribution to Oxford Leader's Spring Song. My name is Natasha Loges, and I am a historian of German song. I'm going to concentrate on two settings, Brahms's setting of Georg Friedrich Dahmer's Wie bist du meine Königin, and Clara Schumann's setting of Hermann Rollet's Geheimes Flüstern, both old favourites of mine. Perhaps one of the challenges of thinking about what composers do to poetry is that when we look back historically, the partnerships can seem very unequal. So, in this case, Brahms is, of course, very famous, whereas Dahmer's fortunes have really waxed and waned. The peak of his popularity was in the 1850s, when a great many people really admired his work. And after that, his reputation gradually declined. He was an advocate of all sorts of things that at the time seemed very strange. For example, vegetarianism, animal rights, Eastern religions. Religion was a real complication with Dahmer. He tended to tack between different versions of Christianity and write manifestos about them, which unsurprisingly made people regard him as a bit of a crank. Here are some of the poetry collections from which many composers selected songs to compose. And the first of these is the Hafiz collection, which Brahms particularly loved. Over the years, I've managed to develop a real soft spot for Dahmer, not least because he was so adventurous. As far as we know, he wasn't particularly expert in any language other than German, but he explored widely in other cultures, and he read a great deal of poetry and then translated into German the ideas, the concepts, and the rhythms that he encountered. And I've listed here some of the languages from which he translated. This is what Dahmer said about translations, that they should be communications, not gaps and barriers. If they repel more than they attract, then they cannot be considered communications, and in this respect, translations. Faithfulness, in the commonly understood sense of the word, is often unfaithfulness in a higher sense. This approach to translation has gone in and out of fashion over the last 150 years. In the early part of the 20th century, people would really have frowned on this attitude and really been striving for fidelity and exactness. But more recently, more poets have been exploring this approach to translation, a sort of collaborative or side-by-side approach, working alongside a language which you don't necessarily speak yourself. And in that sense, the act of translation becomes like a setting in its own regard. Let's look now at the poem Wie bist du meine Königin? It has a really four-square rhythm, and I'll read the first verse for you now so that you can hear that in the German. Wie bist du meine Königin, durch sanfte Güte wonnevoll, du lächle nur, lässt Düfte wehen durch mein Gemüte wonnevoll. I slightly exaggerated the tum-ti-tum-ti-tum rhythm of that poem, but it is also there within the verse itself. Let's read it slightly differently now, trying to make more grammatical sense of it. This is effectively replicating the process that Brahms is known to have undertaken as a composer, that he would memorize a poem and repeat it until what he felt was the true rhythm of the poetry emerged, ready for setting. So, what do you make of this version? Wie bist du, meine Königin, durch sanfte Güte wonnevoll? Du lächle nur, Lenzdüfte wehen durch mein Gemüte, wonnevoll. You can hear that all sorts of pauses and phrases have been introduced already from that first reading. Let's listen now to what Brahms himself does with it. At this point, you can pause your film and go to the first YouTube link of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Hertha Klust's recording of this song from 1955. Okay, my choice of recording was pure indulgence. I cannot resist the sound of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau's voice in the 1950s, and I do think that Herta Klust's exquisitely flexible accompaniment makes the point that I'm trying to make so much more neatly than I could. But the main thing here is that Brahms was really criticized for how he set those first two lines. So instead of setting Wie bist du meine Königin durch sanfte Güte wonnevoll, Brahms sets Wie bist du meine Königin durch sanfte Güte wonnevoll, which sounds terribly wrong. But in fact, it's only wrong if you regard a musical score in the same way that you would regard a poem on the page when I did my first Tumty Tumty reading version, where I said, Wie bist du meine Königin durch sanfte Güte wonnevoll. Poetic rhythms and musical rhythms are only a framework or a starting point from which we can build. If you ignore the bar lines of Brahms's setting, you end up with this gorgeously seamless floating melodic line, which I think creates this sense of timelessness that Brahms is trying to make here. Let's look now at the second verse, in which Brahms arguably commits an even more egregious setting error. The rhythm of the verse on the page is Frisch aufgeblühter Rosenglanz vergleich ich ihn dem deinigen. Ach, über alles, was da blüht, ist deine Blüte wonnevoll. One of the first things we can observe is that in the poetic form which Daumer has chosen, the lines don't rhyme. Glanz, deinigen, blüht, wonnevoll. And I suppose this is kind of a liberation for Brahms because he doesn't have to show rhyming patterns. What he is free to do is to highlight the words that he thinks are most important. In this case, it's the end of the second and the fourth lines, deinigen and wonnevoll. The wonnevoll is important because that is the mark of the Ghazal form which Daumer was trying to imitate. So this is Brahms showing that he's respecting what Daumer has done. The deinigen, I think, is just Brahms indulging himself and indulging the singer by giving them a glorious high note on which they can open up the voice on that eminently singable vowel I.
Frisch aufgeblühter Rosenglanz vergleich ich ihn dem deinigen. Ach, über alles, was da blüht, ist deine Blüte.
We can see in the two verses I've shown you so far that there's always going to be a bit of a tussle between the conflicting priorities when it comes to setting a poem. Certainly, the composer wants to show their understanding of how the poem is built. They want to show their responsiveness to key words. But ultimately, the object that they're trying to create is different from a read out poem, and it has to convey somehow that visceral joy which beautiful singing brings both to the musicians and to the listeners. And sometimes this means that words which feel important when we read out are not so important when we sing. And in fact, we can alter the meaning of a poem, or at least shift it completely in the way we set. So let's look at what Brahms does with this last verse. The sentiment of this verse is quite an overwhelming one. Okay, we start with a cliche, let me die in your arms, fair enough. But the poet continues that death in your embrace will be blissful, even though bitterest mortal agony is raging through my breast. This is a very, very hyperbolic statement. And Brahms could have focused on the negative side of this, the herbste Todesqual, or the sort of car crash of vowels that we hear in Die Brust durch Wüte, which is not an easy thing to sing or indeed to say. What Brahms chooses to do instead is to focus again on the repetition of that glorious word, wonnevoll. And it's perhaps only on this final repetition that we really understand why Brahms repeats the word wonnevoll each time. This is the musical point that he's trying to make, not the suffering, not the longing, but just the bliss of imagining being with the beloved.
Ob auch die Herbste Todesqual die Brust durchwühlte,
Even though I've known this song for many, many years, I never fail to enjoy the metamorphosis of that poem into that song. It seems to me that Brahms so perfectly captures that bittersweet experience of love, that agony and ecstasy combined. It also seems to me that he perfectly understands the poetic form of the ghazal with the emphasis on the ending of the verses and the repetition of that key word. In his lifetime already, Brahms's friends expressed amazement that he was so drawn to the verses of Alma. But I guess this is one of those alchemies that can never really be fully understood from a modern perspective. Dalma is no longer a respected poet, and that's something that I absolutely have to confront. But for Brahms, he touched on expressions, emotions, and forms that were absolutely ripe for setting. And I can imagine in Europe of the 1850s, reeling from the revolutions of 1848 and retreating into a terrifying, narrow minded conservatism, that Dalma's ideas, that the exoticism of the verses that he translated were tremendously appealing to Brahms's generation. I'm going to turn to my second example now, the song Geheimes Flüstern, which Clara Schumann made of a poem by the figure Hermann Rollet. Like Georg Daumer, Rollet is completely obscure now, whereas even Clara Schumann has a significant claim to fame. So again, we have this example of an unequal poet-musician partnership. But again, the partnership was absolutely perfect for its time. Rollet was very sympathetic to the Schumanns because of his strong left-wing tendencies. The structural simplicity of his verses makes them very suitable for musical setting. And in fact, Robert Schumann even wrote to Rollet about the settings that they had made, inviting him to send more poems for setting. That, of course, came to nothing eventually because of Robert Schumann's mental illness and eventual death. But Clara Schumann met him in December 1856 in Vienna when her husband had been dead 5 months. And that was the occasion on which she could give him a signed copy of the 6 songs she'd made of his poems. Let's have a go at the first verse of this poem, exactly as Clara Schumann would have done. This is how it sounds. Geheimes Flüstern hier und dort, verborgnes Quellenrauschen. O Wald, geweihter Ort, lass mich des Liebens reinstes Wort in Zweig und Blatt belauschen. So far, so good. Now, let's try a slightly more animated, even dramatic version, bearing in mind that the poet is actually addressing the woods directly. The first 2 lines set the scene. The actual declaration to the wood emerges in the 3rd line. So perhaps the poem can sound like this, or at least just that first verse. Geheimes Flüstern hier und dort, verborgenes Quellenrauschen. O Wald, geweihter Ort, lass mich des Lebens reinstes Wort in Zweig und Blatt belauschen. I hope that sounded fractionally more interesting than my first version. But what is emerging to me, and perhaps what emerged to Clara Schumann as well, is that the iambic rhythm, the da-dum, da-dum, da-dum rhythm of the poem is actually far deeper embedded than in the first example we looked at, Wie bist du meine Königin? Let's listen now to the whole song performed by Wolfgang Holzmeier with Imogen Cooper. Do listen for the balance between the melodic line that's trying to unfold and the individual words that need to be picked out in order to convey the meaning of the poetry. At this point, you can pause your film and go to the second YouTube link, Wolfgang Holzmeier and Imogen Cooper's recording of Geheimes Flüstern from 2002. Let's look more closely at that third verse. Clara Schumann chose to make what we call a strophic setting, which means that all three verses of the poem are set to identical music. This is absolutely fine as long as the poetic and the musical grammar, so to speak, align in the same places. Let's look at the poem to see where the phrase breaks. And I'll read this out in German now. Was leise mich umschwebt, umklingt, ich will es treu bewahren. Und was mir tief zum Herzen dringt, will ich vom Geist, der lieb beschwingt, in Liedern offenbaren. So we can hear that the poem falls very neatly into 2 plus 3. But the musical grammar of the song that Clara Schumann has constructed falls equally clearly into 3 plus 2. So it really is up to the performers to make sense of this. At this point, you can pause your film and go back to the second YouTube recording of Holzmeier and Cooper. Listen to the third verse, starting at 2 minutes and 15 seconds in. I am much less familiar with Rollet's poetry than I am with Daumer's. I think, like many people, it was only in 2019 that I started spending a serious amount of time with Clara Schumann's music and therefore immersing myself much more carefully in the poetry that she set. But as with Daumer, I'm gradually developing an affection for Rollet's words, for the simplicity of his rhythms and the charm of his images. And I suspect that this is exactly what happened with our composers. It's that repeated, immersive, detailed engagement that grows in us the affection for a poem. The question then of whether the poet is a great or not great one becomes less relevant, I think. They can become great because we choose to give them that attention. I know it's not an original point, but it feels worth making it again with regard to these two songs. And anyway, even if you disagree with me entirely, I hope you've enjoyed the beautiful music. I'm sorry we're not all in the same room today, listening to the wonderful young musicians who are going to perform these songs live for us. But I hope this short presentation goes some way to explaining how poetry can turn into great song. I look forward to seeing you again in the future.